You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're looking at Rachel Whiteread. Now, this one is another fan request, so thank you and a shout out to Sophie all the way from New Zealand. I gotta say, that was really cool to see that someone on the other side of the world is listening to this show. So thanks for listening, and thank you for helping me discover another cool artist, because Rachel Whiteread was an artist whose work I was not familiar with until I started doing the research. But here we go. Rachel Whiteread was born April 20th, 1963 in Ilford, Essex, just outside London. Her mother, Pat Whiteread, was a feminist artist, and her father, Thomas Whiteread, was a geography lecturer, and apparently he kind of had a fascination for urban architecture. This combination of like an artistic environment and an interest in how spaces are structured would eventually become sort of the foundation for Rachel's work. She grew up the youngest of three. She has two older twin sisters, and Rachel is said to have often felt a bit like an outsider growing up. She has said she spent a lot of her childhood in her mother's studio experimenting with materials like papier-mâché and collage. Even as a kid, she was drawn to making big stuff, but she didn't formally commit to studying art until her later teens. She eventually attended Brighton Polytechnic from 1982 to 85, where she started off in painting, but she would eventually become known for her sculptures. A pivotal moment came when she attended a workshop focused on casting methods. It was run by the sculptor Richard Wilson. Now, Wilson had driven a homemade furnace on a trailer down to the school, and Rachel just did sort of simple work. She pressed a spoon into the sand and poured liquid metal into the cavity. When the metal cooled and she pulled it out, she didn't just have a replica of the spoon. She had also captured the space around the spoon, what we would call the negative space. In art, we have two types of space, the positive space and the negative space. The general way to think of it is the positive space is the stuff we're making, the shapes we're drawing, the form we're sculpting, and the negative space is all the space around that. Anyways, she became captivated by sculptural methods, and that led her to the Slade School of Fine Art, where she focused entirely on sculpture. In the late 1980s and 90s, Whiteread became part of a group known as the Young British Artists, or YBAs. Many of her peers were people like Damien Hirst, known for shocking and loud artworks, but Whiteread's work was quiet and contemplative. She became fascinated by, as I said, the negative spaces, the things that often kind of go unnoticed, the empty air inside a cup or the space under a bed or inside of a room. She decided that instead of sculpting an object, she would sculpt the air, filling those empty spaces with materials like plaster, resin, or concrete. The first major breakthrough in this vein came in 1990 with a piece called Ghost. She took an entire room in a Victorian house and filled it with plaster and then removed the walls. The result was a solid block that showed the inside of the room as a solid object. You could see indentations of the light switches, the door frame, even the texture of the wallpaper, but it was all in reverse. It turned that familiar space into something eerie, but also big, solid, and kind of monumental. In 1993, she became the first woman to win the prestigious Turner Prize. This coincided with possibly one of her most controversial works, House. This time, it wasn't just a room. She cast an entire 3-story Victorian terraced house in London in concrete. When the original brick shell was removed, a ghostly, solid interior of the home was left standing on a street corner. This sparked some conversations, not just about the art and, the classic, is it art? But also it got people talking about like the housing crisis and bigger, broader issues. Whiteread's work often feels like sort of a death mask for objects. She casts the empty space of a mattress, a water bottle, and captures the traces of human use, the slumps and folds, and wear and tear. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, she continued to receive major international commissions, including the Judenplatz Holocaust Memorial in Vienna, also known as the Nameless Library. And this was a massive concrete sculpture that kind of looks like a library, but all the books are turned inward so the titles can't be read. It becomes a haunting symbol of the lost lives and lost stories of the millions of victims. Then in 2005, she was invited to take on one of the biggest challenges, the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern in London. The space is vast. I mean, it was a former power station, and many artists could find it intimidating. Whiteread spent months thinking about how to fill it without just making something big for the sake of being big. She ultimately created a piece called Embankment. It wasn't one giant sculpture. Instead, she created a sprawling, mountainous landscape made of 14,000 white translucent boxes. And these aren't just any boxes. They're casts made from polyethylene, a type of plastic. To create them, she took 10 different types of old cardboard boxes, filled them with plaster to get the shape, and then used those forms to manufacture thousands of plastic replicas. The installation was massive. There were stacks of boxes going up toward the ceiling. They looked like white cliffs or glaciers. And then there were other areas where they were spread out in low-level rows. Visitors could walk through the gaps between the piles, which felt like navigating an icy maze or a giant warehouse. Because the polyethylene is translucent, the boxes could seem to glow slightly in the lighting, giving the whole room a cold, ethereal, and kind of quiet atmosphere despite the enormous, overwhelming scale of the work. The inspiration for Embankment came while Whiteread was clearing out her mother's house after she'd passed away. She came across an old, worn cardboard box that she remembered from her childhood. It was a simple object, but it held a memory of her family's belongings. This started her thinking about how we use boxes to store our lives, our photos, toys, books, all sorts of stuff. And these boxes eventually become ghosts of the things they once held. By casting the inside of the boxes, Whiteread captured every tiny detail. The staples, ripples in the cardboard, marks of old packaging tape, and even the stamps from shipping companies. Since she casts the negative space, the insides become the outsides. The boxes are empty, yet they look solid. And this plays with our sense of what's there and what's missing, and that's kind of a recurring theme in her work. The piece really kind of centers around the idea of, quote, unforgettable forgotten, end quote. The title itself refers to the Thames embankment nearby, but it's also this idea of a barrier or flood defense. These 14,000 boxes form a physical barrier in the hall, representing the sheer volume of stuff we accumulate throughout our lives. Ask anyone who's been in their home for more than a few years. They've got a lot of boxes. It's just kind of human nature, with the way we kind of try to organize everything in our existence. And some people also see a connection with the final scene in the classic movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the Ark of the Covenant is nailed into a generic wooden crate and lost in a sea of thousands of identical boxes in a government warehouse. Embankment captures that same sense of anonymity, the idea that once something is boxed up and stored away, it becomes part of a vast, silent history that, with every passing day and year, gets harder and harder to navigate or much less remember. it kind of reminds me of Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning. I mean, we've got these 14,000 ghosts of ordinary cardboard boxes suggesting a powerful story of memory, loss, and the spaces we inhabit, proving that even the most empty spaces are still full of meaning. This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.